you wrote a couple of posts that I think we've touched on it a bit in episodes, but I want to go deeper, which is there's this broader myth around, or this sort of story around how the middle class got hollowed out in America, and as a result of trade and globalization. And you are here to set the record straight and say what actually happened. So why don't we get into it?
Exactly. So the there to reiterate what this myth is, there's this idea that, in the 1950s and 60s, we had rapid wage growth and like everybody was sort of a blue collar manufacturing worker, and we had this strong middle class unionized blue collar workforce. And then in the 70s, it started to go wrong, and then et cetera, et cetera, and wages stagnated, and we had this massive rise in inequality between rich and poor. The middle class got hollowed out, and then because of globalization, competition from foreign countries, our country was put at an unfair disadvantage because of trade deficits. These foreign imports flooded in and outcompeted our own manufacturing workers because we didn't protect our market. And because of that, we stopped having our middle class, and now we're a nation of winners and losers, where the losers work as checkout clerks and the winners work as like software engineers and managers and stuff. That's the narrative. And maybe that's a little bit of a caricature or a straw man, but I think that it fits very closely some of the things we've seen, respectable pundits saying in the media recently. It doesn't deviate very far from what I just said. The narrative is wrong. So there is like a tiny nubbin of truth there, like a tiny little core of truth, that is very, very small, wrapped in a giant, sort of gooey blanket of myth making. So I'm here to set the record straight, 95%. All right. But 5% of that is true. And I'll talk about that later. But first, let's talk about the myth part. First of all, the American middle class was not hollowed out at all. Like, you had some places, like you had the Rust Belt, that was a real thing. And you had areas that had been more dependent on manufacturing, got hurt more economically by like the recessions of the early 80s that were used to destroy inflation, things like that. And you had certain towns look really bad, like Flint, Michigan. You've seen Roger and Me. So some of these towns, these old industrial towns, look pretty crappy. Okay, and so you certainly had a lot of ex-manufacturing workers who then, were laid off from their factory jobs and didn't do well after that. But if you look at sort of your median income, you're just like typical person in America, they didn't experience falling income. They experienced rising income. And income rose more slowly in the 70s and 80s than it had before. And it rose and than it did after. So there was a stagnation in income, but it never really went down. Okay, so then, and I'm talking about median, right? I'm not talking about averages, so we're not talking about like Elon Musk bringing up the average or whatever. The incomes never really went down, and if you look at wages, they stagnated. They were basically flat for 20 years. If you look at real wages, now when I say wages, I'm not including things like healthcare benefits or pension matching, that your 401k contribution or pension contributions for a defined benefit pension or any of those retirement contributions. I'm not including any of that because those aren't counted as wages. Those are counted as benefits. And if you include benefits, compensation kept going up and up. But we had a pause in wages while we paid people in benefits instead. So you did have wage stagnation, but the wage stagnation ended sort of in the late 90s. And then since then, wages have been going up at almost as fast as they did in the post-war decades. And when I say wages, I'm talking about median wages. I'm talking about average hourly earnings of production non-supervisory workers. I'm talking about medians. I'm talking about the middle class here. Your average typical wage earner, not high-paid CEOs, all right? And so, everything I say is like in medians because I'm not going to like use sleight of hand to try to, obscure things, where a few people getting rich brings up the average. I'm not going to do that, all right? So we're talking about medians, and the 2000s, which is when import competition from cheap Chinese imports and our trade deficit were at a peak, and we had this collapse in manufacturing employment by several million, like 3 million people. Even during that decade, wages kept going up faster than they had in like the 70s and 80s when we were not nearly as globalized. The real era of globalization doesn't line up with the era of wage stagnation. The era of hyperglobalization began in the late 90s and continued, through like the 2010s, or mid 2010s, let's say. During that era of hyperglobalization, wages grew for the middle class. Middle class wages grew, and working class wages grew by like 40%. I'm talking about the 10th percentile, 20th percentile, 30th percentile, 40th percentile of the income distribution. The lower ends of the income distribution, those actually grew during the time of hyperglobalization and stagnated before. So as for so that's part of the myth. And so the other, and by the way, if you there's this idea that all these laid off manufacturing workers went and got crappy service sector jobs, right? They went and got jobs as like, fry cooks and cashiers and whatever, drivers and stuff like that. Well, that did happen in the 2000s. You did have quite a bit of that. It wasn't enough to pull down the aggregate statistics that much, but you did have, a 1.5% of the labor force or something this kind of happened to, right? And that's a decent number. That's a decent amount of people. That's millions of people, 2 million, maybe even 3 million, but like that lost these good jobs and that had to get mostly got crappy jobs in the service sector as a result. That sucks. And however, our intuition about this is out of date, because starting around 2010 or so, the number of crappy service sector jobs actually started falling, and instead people got professional jobs. So people started going to management and business and various business services kind of things. And then STEM really shot up. A lot more STEM workers in America. And then education, health, the sort of higher value services. So if you look at, but the biggest one was business and management. And then STEM had a pretty big increase as well. And so if you look at what people were doing in the 2010s, things started healing, and Bill Clinton's sort of old dream that professional service jobs would become like the new mass jobs, mass employment for the masses, that's finally started coming true in the 2010s. But by then, our intuition was baked in. Our intuition about the Rust Belt and about these people getting kicked out of manufacturing, going to these crappy service sector jobs, all this intuition was baked in. And, it was a little too late to change. And so most of our policy debates since then, including the policies, I would argue, of the Trump administration, have been, but also lots of stuff the left wanted to do as well, were informed by this sort of outdated view of what was going on in the economy. The other part of the myth, I'd say, is that America was never actually a very globalized country. So if you look at import penetration, like just the imports relative to GDP, America is much lower than most other countries. We're lower than China. We're much lower than like France or Germany or any of these countries. These countries are importing much more than we do relative to their economy. If you look at our trade deficit, our trade deficit is substantial. I would say if you look at the manufacturing trade deficit only, it's about 4% of GDP. We make up some of that on services, but manufacturing trade deficit, 4% of GDP. That's, kind of big, but it's not, that's much, much less than the percent by which manufacturing has shrunk as a share of our economy, right? If you got rid of that whole trade deficit, and if 100% of that went into like just increasing only domestic manufacturing, which is unrealistic, but if that happened, you could only reverse, a fairly modest part of the decrease in manufacturing in America in terms of our percentage of output. You would not reindustrialize the country a lot. And so, in fact, because manufacturing then consumes a lot of services, you would only reindustrialize the country by like maybe Krugman estimates by about 2.5%. So that would only cancel out the changes since 2007 in terms of manufacturing output as a fraction of our output. And so America was never that globalized. And actually, if you look at countries that have protected their manufacturing bases more effectively, like Japan's manufacturing has not really shrunk that much as a share of GDP. They've had a trade deficit since 2010. But if you look at France, like in the 80s and 90s, France had a big decrease in manufacturing as a share of GDP, but they had a huge trade surplus. So trade surplus and deficits can affect manufacturing, but it's not determinative. And so America has never been a very globalized country compared to other countries, and trade deficits are something we harp on all the time, but they're a relatively minor piece of the story. And the middle class didn't get hollowed out at all So the basic ideas of what happened, with the trade deficits and globalization and the Rust Belt and the middle class and all this story we have are basically not true.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/zen. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/zen. netsuite.com/zen. So it's a new year, 2025. And one of the recurring questions I've already been receiving is, should I start my own business? Can I do it all on my own? Now more than ever, my answer is a resounding yes, with tools like today's sponsor, Shopify. It's never been easier to start pursuing your dreams. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. No coding or design skills required. They also help with the details like shipping, taxes, payments, and have social media tools that connect all your channels and create shoppable posts, allowing you to focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. What happens if you don't act now? Will you regret it? What if someone beats you to the idea? Don't kick yourself when you hear this again in a year because you didn't do anything now. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/momentofzen, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/momentofzen. There's this website, What the Fuck Happened in 1971, and people, point to some of these things. Why do you think they get these? Why did they get it wrong?
Well, so what happened in 1971 was actually in 1973 is the oil shock, right? Just for the for people who don't know this, the thing that happened in 1971 was the end of Bretton Woods, and there's some people who think that because we got off the gold standard, Bretton Woods wasn't a real gold standard, but we lied and called it that. But people think that because Bretton Woods ended, then we had an era of globalization, and then that's what began hollowing out the middle class. So that people say that, but Bretton Woods kept the American exchange rate very expensive. Okay, and when we ended Bretton Woods, the dollar depreciated. That makes our exports more competitive and makes it more difficult for us to buy imports. Okay, so if the end of Bretton Woods, had been the big thing that happened in the 1970s, we would have seen things move in the opposite direction. All right, and we wouldn't have seen globalization and the hollowing out of the middle class. We wouldn't have seen that. We would have seen the kind of the opposite because Bretton Woods. The end of Bretton Woods in 1971 depreciated our exchange rate. It made us less important as a reserve currency. So anyway, because during Bretton Woods, basically there was a law. It was a rule that said the dollar has to be the reserve currency. It's just the law. Okay, by international agreement. We got rid of that, and the dollar really went down and down as a share of international reserve currency, and then it started climbing in the 90s again. We had what we called the second Bretton Woods, but that's another story. The point is, what really happened was 1973. The oil shock, and then another oil shock in 79 with the Iranian Revolution. But the 73 oil shock was bigger. It signified the end of cheap oil. Okay. And the era of cheap oil came to an end. You watch movies about the 60s and you see these people cruising these big, like muscle cars, gigantic, boats that got 3 miles a gallon. I don't know, like cruising them down the street, constantly filling up their gigantic gas tanks and just blasting it with inefficient engines and fumes filling the air. Like you watch the movie American Graffiti, and that's basically what it was. People were just racing cars for fun. We had cheap energy. When cheap energy ended, it was very difficult to convert our economy to one that was very energy conscious. And it wasn't, globalization really didn't, we had a little bit of globalization in the 70s and 80s, but it was mostly in the late 90s that we had globalization. And especially that we had China. Certainly NAFTA didn't come till much later. And but the era of wage stagnation in the 70s and 80s was when we were dealing with cheap oil. Oil came down in the late 80s, right? So we dealt with a decade of cheap oil, and then it came down later, but then, we were still sort of retooling our economy based on that. So we were not able to do the manufacturing procedure that we did in the 50s and 60s, which is throw tons of energy into highly inefficient, manufacturing. Our manufacturing is not as efficient, and countries that had dealt with resource scarcity and resource constraints in World War II, i.e. the Axis, did a little bit better job because they were used to making do with less. And they were very focused on efficiency. Japan and Germany had very energy efficient manufacturing compared to us. And so they did a little bit better, but still not, it hit everybody very hard. Japanese growth really cratered in the 1970s. People think of like the 80s as this time of growth, and yeah, it was fine. It was 4%, but like Japanese growth was like 9-10% before 1973, and then just like boom, fell off a cliff. So like, because the energy, it hit everybody hard, and nuclear power didn't come to fill the gap because you can't cart it around. You can't put like a little nuke engine in your car, so transportation machinery didn't work. But then also because of the well-known barriers that we put up to nuclear construction. So nuclear didn't save us. I wish it had. It did save France. France built the nuclear, but then France still deindustrialized. France still had a smaller manufacturing percent. So it didn't completely save France, but it helped, France. And so we could have done it. It would have helped us, but we didn't do it. But more importantly, oil just couldn't stay that cheap forever. Even had you not had the OPEC, the Arab countries, embargoing us, even had that not happened, oil would have gotten, eventually more expensive just because we didn't have many increases in oil. We hadn't invented fracking yet. We didn't have many increases in oil drilling capabilities. And then we were just sucking the cheap oil out of the ground as fast as we could. There was a big bonanza. That bonanza had a shelf life. We never hit peak oil, but we hit peak cheap, easily available oil. We started having to go to deep water, tar sands, heavy oil, all this Siberia, all this hard stuff, right? Fracking, shale oil, tight oil. We started having to go to all that stuff. I know oil very well. I did, summer program with petroleum engineering for petroleum engineering at the Texas A&M.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I know a little bit about oil. I won all the engineering competitions by doing very unorthodox strategies. So like, I'd basically cheat by finding loopholes in the rules, and everybody did not like that. But I thought I was such a clever little kid.
What were the loopholes?
Oh, so like at one point there was like, make the strongest bridge you can with straws. Everyone was like, okay, well let's like cross beams and let's have a truss and let's do engineering principles. I was like, they didn't say what we could do with the straws, so I braided the straws into a rope bridge. I was like, rope bridge, and so then we had a rope bridge.
Oh, sweet.
And so that was insanely strong. It couldn't even break it. What else did we do? We had an oil derrick where they give us some like dimensions, like, area to perimeter ratio that you had to do. And I was like, wait a second, if we have more, this is going to be stronger if I make a longer perimetered area. So let's make a triangular base. Now, it wouldn't be good for a real oil derrick, but it was for ours. So there's many reasons why you wouldn't want a triangular base. You'd actually want to maximize the internal area so you could like drop a thing and, but they would say, oh, you give us this, so let's make a triangular base. So I was just like, just cheated again and again, but legal cheating. And so that, but I did learn about petroleum at the time.
Okay. So back to where we were before the oil tangent.
1973, wage stagnation in the 70s and 80s. What really happened? Why did America deindustrialize? The reasons for deindustrialization aren't entirely clear. I have a sneaking suspicion. My sneaking suspicion is that deindustrialization is exaggerated in statistics because we have more outsourcing and we split up domestic outsourcing, not foreign offshoring. And we split manufacturing companies into the service arms and the assembly line arms. And we called only the latter manufacturing, while countries that kept things more vertically integrated called their accounting departments manufacturing. That's my suspicion. but I have to go prove that in the data, and that's just a suspicion for now. But certainly we suffered because of things. Our, famously, our car companies didn't do as well as Japanese car companies in the 70s. Japanese, because we just relied on cheap energy and captive domestic markets. One thing is that we're such a big country that big countries actually kind of suck at manufacturing compared to small countries. Small countries specialize more, but they do a lot better because they have to sell overseas. They have no choice but to export. This is not an ironclad rule. Germany's like a medium big country, and they do great. Okay, and so it's not a hard and fast rule, but generally when you have this protected domestic market, you lose competitiveness in the long run because you don't manufacture. So Japan is bad at exporting and has a large domestic market, and they've gotten outcompeted in manufacturing by the Koreans and the Taiwanese, who have smaller countries, and they have no choice but to export or die. Like those countries have like 40 to 60% of their economies are exports. Japan is 15, or it's not 15 now. It was 15 until like a couple of years ago when the yen got weak, but it was 15 during the heyday of their industrialization. Japan just wasn't exporting as much. Japanese people were selling to other Japanese people, and because of this, they got kind of weak and wimpy and flaccid and flabby and just didn't know how to sell. So yes, they were energy efficient. That was fine, and they had that little burst of like exports to America at one point, but like, overall, they didn't know how to like make platforms, integrate software. They got outcompeted by the iPhone, right? Laptop companies or Samsung TVs or just like anything. They got outcompeted. Now they're getting outcompeted by Chinese EVs because they just had this protected domestic market that they did, and they didn't get out much. And so I think that's ultimately one big reason for flabby American manufacturing. So I think there's a number of things going on. We saw productivity flatlining in American manufacturing after about 2008. And then productivity in other kinds of manufacturing flatlined earlier. America has a bond finance system instead of a bank finance system. So it's very hard for manufacturing companies to scale up, which, means that's hard for them to like buy the latest capital equipment. That's going to reduce your productivity right there. You can't buy the latest. So we have problems buying capital equipment because you have to use bonds instead of banks to finance things. We captured the commanding heights of the global economy by doing the knowledge-based industries, the software and the finance and the biotech and the, all these things, plus advanced manufacturing. We'd make you the world's most powerful laser. We'd make you some high-end chips. We'd make you some like chip making equipment. We'd make you some like top-end stuff. We'd make you Boeing airplanes, but we wouldn't make you, which until recently, those were good. Those are the best until recently. And so then, but we'd make you all this great stuff, but like it wasn't as high volume. We had some like elite manufacturing, but we captured the commanding heights, and we focused on capturing all the commanding heights of the economy. And we let the base sort of disintegrate because the base requires bank financing. And it's much less productive. It doesn't have as big a return on equity. I'll write about this more, but there's a number of reasons we deindustrialized, but then through it all, our middle class kept making more and more money. There was a painful 20-year period where there was kind of stagnation of the middle class. But then after that, the middle class started really growing again. If you look at, levels of income, every level of income had people flowing out, almost all flowing out to the upper levels of income. The middle class shrank because people started becoming upper class. People left the middle, like, if you look intergenerationally, I mean, like, for example, me, I was raised middle class. Actually, when I, for a few years when I was a kid, I was lower middle class. I would say we didn't have a garage. We had one bathroom. I shared a bed with my sister. We had black and white TV when I was a little kid, long after we should not have had a black and white TV. So like I was lower middle class for a few years, and then middle class for most of it. And then I'm upper class now. Like we have this upward mobility, but that's what happened. So yes, inequality increased, but inequality increased because people were moving up.
So what's the 5% that's right?
The 5% that's right is that in the 2000s, for about 5 or 6 years, there was this massive surge of Chinese imports that devastated a lot of U.S. manufacturing competitiveness. And basically, manufacturers could not compete. They had to ship stuff to China just for the China price. China had unbeatable advantages. They had cheap labor. They had cheap land. Cheap labor is only like some fraction of it, right? A lot of it is cheap land. They could build anything, and they could kick peasants off their land for free, essentially. China kicked all the peasants off their land and built factories. They had cheap energy from coal, which they just subsidized to hell and didn't care about climate change or coal smoke or pollution or anything. So they had cheap energy. They dumped all the shit in the water. They had cheap pollution. They just dumped shit in the water till their rivers died. And this is in the 2000s. They're not like this anymore, but this is what they were in the 2000s. It's an old story. Story's over. But it happened. It was the China shock. And Americans couldn't compete with that. And this is what the Seattle protesters in 1999 had warned about if we joined the WTO, because in fact, it was letting China into the WTO that did this. And it was this, and estimates say that this was responsible for about 2 million lost manufacturing jobs out of a total of 3 million that decade. And it was big, it was fast, it was abrupt, and and more often than not, the people who lost those manufacturing jobs did go to shitty service sector jobs, at least for a while. Or maybe if they were older, for the rest of their careers. There were people who got totally screwed by this. And so that China shock was real. It did hurt a segment of the middle and working class. And it probably contributed a little bit to inequality. And it did happen because of globalization. So that's the little nugget of truth at the center of the myth.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Every time I hop on the 101 freeway in SF, I look up at the various tech billboards and think, damn, turpentine should definitely be up there. And I bet I'm not alone. In a world of endless scrolling and ad blockers, sometimes the most powerful way to reach people is in the real world. That's where AdQuick comes in. The easiest way to book out-of-home ads, like billboards, vehicle wraps, and airport displays. The same way you would order an Uber. Started by Instacart alums, AdQuick was born from their own personal struggles to book and measure ad success. AdQuick's audience targeting, campaign management, and analytics bring the precision and efficiency of digital to the real world. Ready to get your brand the attention it deserves? Visit adquick.com today to start reaching your customers in the real world. Again, that's adquick.com. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For back-end, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention turpentine to skip the waitlist. If Oren Cass was in this conversation and heard all of it, or I'm just thinking of someone who's, more of a protectionist, or, has more of this narrative of, hey, the middle class hollowed out, what would they say to all this? Would they agree with it? Would they push back? Or
Would probably push back. But I don't exactly know how they'd push back. I can imagine some bad arguments they might make, but I don't want to put those words in their mouth and argue shadowbox with like a crappy version. I'd like to steelman it, but I think I have steelmanned it already by saying that, like, in the 2000s, there was this story. And it doesn't line up with the era of wage stagnation, but it did happen. Like, something like this did happen. And in the future, it could happen. Like, if we just allow in all Chinese imports, we could have another China shock from Chinese high-tech manufacturing overcapacity and subsidized stuff. We could have China shock too, and some countries are experiencing this right now. And so, like, maybe that's worth guarding against with tariffs. And so it could happen. It happened before. It could happen again. It's not good for us, right? It wasn't helpful for us. And I'd say that we made a mistake. It's just not the big story that's happening in terms of loss of manufacturing, in terms of what's happened to the middle class, in terms of the effects of globalization. It's not the main story.
what is the main story?
The main story is just that the American economy pretty much works. I mean, there's this big long-term story about the shift from atoms to bits when energy got more expensive. That's a big long-term story. All right. And that put us through a period of disruption, I'd say. I'd say that financialization of our economy is like that's like a decently large story, making everything private equity and bond markets instead of like bank finance. So those are fairly big stories, but ultimately the biggest story is that the American economy just works. Capitalism works. It succeeds. It grows wealth It grows income for the middle class, and it has done so. And it's not smooth and even. The growth isn't smooth and even. It's interrupted by recessions, by technological shifts, and by other stuff. But each increase is bigger than the decrease. And so that's the biggest story, is that our economy just works.
And the reason why this is important is because we have this narrative that the middle class is being hollowed out as a way to justify some of the economic protectionism. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. It makes people fight tariffs less hard than they would, because you've got lots of progressives out there and progressive leaning columnists out there saying, basically, like Joe Nocera and Talman Joseph Smith were two of the people who were recently writing this stuff, and they're basically like, well, of course the tariff implementation is wrong, but we need to do something about this. This was just the wrong thing. And there's they're certainly right that it's the wrong thing, because tariffs deindustrialize us. I keep harping on this idea that tariffs stop our manufacturers from being able to leverage supply chains, forcing them down the value chain, and it also robs our manufacturers of export markets, which reduces their total TAM. So those are reasons why, even if you think restoring American manufacturing is the most important thing, tariffs are probably bad. Tariffs are definitely bad. I mean, like, they're just, it's not smart. And so in that, we all kind of agree. At least the sensible people agree, I think. And Orrin Cass would disagree, but a lot of people, like, who are talking up this narrative would actually agree with me about tariffs. But beyond that, the question of what do we need to do? Do we need to deglobalize? Do we need to fight globalization in order to restore the American middle class? Well, no, we don't. That's not how it works.
That's well articulated. Yeah, at some point we'll have to get Orrin on, or someone who is a protectionist. But I'm glad we've sort of laid out the case now. But let's transfer over
there. No, let me just say, there are measures that I'm in favor of that would classify as protectionism. I'm certainly for targeted tariffs on Chinese products where a wave of Chinese subsidized overcapacity threatens to quickly destroy one of our industries. Because once that industry is destroyed, when the Chinese wave recedes, it's hard for us to build it back because we have trouble building stuff. And we need to make it more easy to build stuff. I'm for industrial policy. I'm for export promotion. I don't think imports are bad. I think exports are good. Okay. I want to focus on exports and not on imports.
And why is that?
Because exports increase our TAM. Right? When we can sell to the world, it means our manufacturers get economies of scale. Not only that, they also learn more about foreign markets. They import foreign technologies more. They're forced to compete against the world's best. Okay, and so I think we should promote exports. But imports, the thing about imports is many of them are inputs into domestic production. So, and also, protecting ourselves against imports makes our manufacturers safe in the short term and flabby in the long term, because they don't have to compete. Remember, exports are all about competitiveness, compete on the world market. Import substitution is about lack of competitiveness. Protection will make our manufacturers weak and flabby and unable to compete internationally. But yet, I still think we need to subsidize them, both to compete with the Chinese who subsidize theirs, and also just to, push and prod our manufacturers to, like, get out of their local American sandbox. So some people are going to call these things protectionist. Certainly they're economic nationalist and they're pro-manufacturing. And I believe these things. I am not like a dogmatic free trader at all. I just think that, like, we're doing it wrong. And part of the reason we can't stop doing it wrong is because we're wedded to this sort of master narrative that won't let go. But that's just mostly wrong.
Yeah.
We need to get rid of that. We need to replace it with a new master narrative that says export's good. It's a thing we add to our economy. We need to basically add manufacturing back into our economy. We don't need to replace other stuff. We need to add it back in. How do you add without destroying other stuff? You increase your TAM. Exports.
What justifies the exports or the skepticism around exports at the moment?
I don't know. So I actually don't know that there's skepticism about that. It's just lack of focus. It's just that, Trump is, and so, I mean, the root cause of it is that America is very large and we've always been this closed off country. So we tend not to think in terms of exports. America has always thought of ourselves as being the whole world market. We are the world. And in that, someday China will be there too. Like China People think China's export oriented, but exports are relentlessly falling as a share of Chinese GDP. Like just falling, falling, falling. In the 2000s, remember this decade that formed a lot of our current stereotypes that are wrong. In the 2000s, China was incredibly export oriented. And they had this brief boom where the currency was real undervalued. They just exported. Now, China's exporting their surplus shit. China's exporting their surplus. They're producing mostly for the domestic market and then exporting extra.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing. Chinese, a larger and larger share of China. So actually, let me, look this up. And let me see what their numbers are. I'll just look at the World Bank here. Okay, so then in 2006, the peak of Chinese exports were 36% of Chinese GDP. That's within a ballpark of Korea. That's a lot, okay? And it shot up. It was huge. It was very small in 2000. It was 20 in 2001, which is like a reasonable, fairly closed off country, right? Not super closed, but fairly closed. It was 20 in 2001. It shot up to 36 in 2006. They had this amazing decade of export promotion, and really just a 5-year, 6-year thing. It was very short. That was the China shock. Now it stands at 19.7, which is lower than when it joined the WTO in 2023. So 22 years after China joined the WTO, exports are a smaller share of its GDP than before it joined the WTO. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So the reason is because of Chinese domestic growth. Sure, they export a lot, but they're huge. They're more and more, China is an inwardly focused economy, building stuff for other Chinese people. And so the reason we're getting a flood of exports is because now they weren't honking big in 2001 because like they were still poor, but now they're honking big. And honking big is actually a larger unit than fucking big, actually. Honking is like, oh man, honk. So like, anyway, just Texanism there. But so, like, China's so honking big that even a little bit of so like you look at China's become the world's largest car exporter in just a couple of years. Amazing surge, right? And yet Chinese car exports are a tiny fraction of Chinese car production. Almost all Chinese cars are sold in China. China's going to get America's same disease in half a century. Maybe we'll still be alive. When maybe we'll live to see China get American disease and just become this insular place. They got it back before Europeans sailed around and forced them to open up,
Yeah. Maybe let's segue in our last remaining 15 minutes around sort of, you wrote about Sino-Futurism, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Sino-Futurism, but basically like in a world where China becomes more and more powerful, what does that mean for the for the rest of the world? How should we think about sort of, because right now our culture is so infused by America being the sort of the hegemon. So why don't you share some reflections on that?
All right. So there's been a boom now. Most people are not in this discourse, but there's been a boom in people saying, "Oh my God, China's the future, man." They go to China, they see vast forests of gleaming new buildings, and at night, those buildings, they put LEDs on those buildings and light them up for these incredible light shows. They've been doing that since the 2010s. They see high-speed rail network that is bigger than all the rest of the world combined by far. Add up all the high-speed rail in the world, in the rest of the world besides China, it's like a little more than half of what China's got. It's crazy. And they built that just in a few years. You see the vast manufacturing, you have vast factories. Then you see high-tech stuff. You see drone shows, spectacular drone shows. You see electric cars everywhere with these giant screens inside the car. It looks really futuristic. Okay, you've got and then you see drones delivering stuff everywhere, little delivery robots everywhere you go. It's cool, it's futuristic, it's new. People are like, wow, China's the future, man. I think that people want to think there's a positive future, and they say, okay, well, Europe's not the future because it's sclerotic and stagnant. They can't build anything. America's not the future because A, you can't build anything, but B, Trump is just going to smash with tariffs. And so like, that's not the future. He's going to cut research funding, ban mRNA vaccines, and just like basically smash everything that's good and functional about America. So that's bad. And so where do we put our hopes? China is firing on all cylinders. They make all the great stuff. They have all these amazing, beautiful cities. Everything's clean. There's no crime. You get robots will deliver food right to your door. But then, okay, so Chinese futurism is not all it's cracked up to be. Number one, those gleaming cities, they're all new, and reinforced concrete doesn't last that long, man. And depending on how well you build, you could build really high quality stuff that will last for 50 years without showing visible signs of wear. But they don't. They use mediocre stuff. It's going to show signs of wear in 30 years. You have stuff now that was built in the 90s in China that's already looks shabby and old. And also, especially when it's wet, it gets discolored. You get rain streaks, discoloration all on the outside. It gets weathered. It gets worn down. And then it spalls. You get the rebar inside gets rusty, corroded, and then it cracks. And then the moisture flows into the cracks in the concrete. And then it spalls. It just cracks off, flakes off, breaks. You've seen old concrete. That's what happens. Give it a few years. Everything was built in the 2010s. Everything. That's when China built there. So in the 2040s, expect to see China look shabby. Unless they do what Japan does and they devote a huge percent of their GDP toward rebuilding constantly everything. You ever see Fraggle Rock when you were a kid?
I never saw it.
Oh, you're too young for Fraggle Rock. There were these little guys called Fraggles who lived under the earth, and they were sort of like these gnome troll kind of guys. And then there were these even smaller guys called Doozers who were just like a bunch of construction workers and were constantly building structures out of radishes that the Fraggles would eat. And the Fraggles would eat, and the Doozers would just build more. And those Doozers are basically like Japan, because they're always rebuilding. They're scrapping and rebuilding. If an earthquake doesn't scrap things for them, they're rebuilding. They're scrapping and rebuilding on their own. Or war, I suppose. And then Japan always rebuilds and rebuilds and rebuilds. Scrap, tears down everything and rebuilds. But that takes a lot of people and a lot of capital and a lot of materials and a lot of effort. All right. So far, it doesn't seem likely for China to do that. First of all, because everybody Japan, you can do this because everybody rents. In China, everybody owns. It's an ownership society, man. It's got a 91% homeownership rate. Everyone owns a condo. You scrap and build, people just lost their condos that they thought they owned. They'll get really mad. So it's very difficult. And so China will probably end up looking more like Taiwan, Hong Kong, which look, big, built up, dense, but also shabby as hell. Have you been to those places? They look shabby. Taiwan looks shabby. Hong Kong looks shabby now. Hong Kong looked amazing, glittering stuff in the 70s and 80s. Now it just looks weathered and worn, run down. It's very cyberpunk. Cyberpunk's cool, but it's also punk. Japan doesn't look cyberpunk. Japan looks like the inside of a spaceship. And so expect to see Chinese stuff look worse. And all those LEDs displays that everybody likes on those Chinese buildings, that causes light pollution. People are already starting to complain. And so because China's already built out, man. It's built out. It's done. This is the best it's ever going to look. And so then there's that. And then in terms of technology, yes, China's ahead of the world in physical technologies, robots, drones, those kind of, and electric cars. It's ahead in those technologies. Will it stay ahead in those technologies? Maybe. I mean, Germany stayed ahead for centuries in the stuff it was good at, and is still ahead in many of those things. Right? America stayed ahead in aerospace, semiconductors, many things, right? Many countries stay ahead in these industries, but other industries will pop up, and making the things that China's flagship companies, Huawei and BYD, get rich for dominating will not be the only markets in the world. They'll get disrupted. Maybe those companies are good enough not to get disrupted, but many of the Chinese companies will just get disrupted. If you looked in the 1980s, Japanese companies were absolutely on top of the world. You saw, Sony, Panasonic, Sharp, Hitachi, Toshiba, Fujitsu, NEC, and all these companies, right? These massive world-beating companies in like and components and stuff. Then now you've got like only a couple left, or that are really top, and most are either sold off or like really just withered away. The same will happen to China. The same happened to America. Same will happen to China. But There's a cycle. And so we're at the peak of the cycle, and everyone's like, oh, China will reign for 1,000 years. Nick Denton said, what we're seeing is not just a Chinese century, but a whole shift of civilization from west to east that will last for many centuries. And I'm like, bro, it's like you saw some nice buildings. Wait 30 years. Reinforced concrete spalls. And so, like, and Dorkesh got this, right? Dorkesh, our boy Dorkesh, he really got this. He's like, China looks like a country that was built at a per capita GDP of 10K. As for how the Chinese cities were built, that's another thing. Like, America built the suburbs, and other countries built like much more dense urban stuff. And we always debate this, right? Would you rather have the peace and quiet of the suburbs and the space and the big houses and nice lawns, or would you rather have dense walkability, trains, and blah, 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 blah? Okay. It's a real debate. Obviously, people like both of those. I see the appeal of both. China's got really, not really either one. They've got neither. Because what they built instead are these giant gated communities full of fairly non-dense, like only medium density tower in the park structures, where you have huge towers, but then these huge parks in between the towers that like reduce the density so that everyone can have maximum sunlight. And then they're gated communities that are usually surrounded by wide arterial roads, relatively far from public transit. And in fact, you drive. And when you drive to a mall. That's what you do. In China, you live in a gated community in a reasonably small apartment, and you drive to the mall. That is life in China. And then you watch TikTok, except it's censored TikTok. Like, that sounds fine if you're coming from rural poverty or like the squalor of urban tenements. Okay. But if you want to live like a middle-class lifestyle, what I just described sucks. That sucks. It's all of the isolation of the suburbs, suburbs and mall kind of development of suburban America with none of the luxurious space. So it's the worst of both worlds in that way. So that's a lot of people complain about this. They call it high density sprawl.
Let me ask you maybe this question towards closing. Like, you had a post a few weeks ago, I think, of like, is this going to be a Chinese century? What is the set of metrics that are going to determine whether or not it's a Chinese American? What do you look at?
Well, they'll have the biggest economy, and unless India can overtake them, they'll have the biggest economy at the end of the century. They'll have the most manufacturing, which will give them the most military power of any country in the world. They will be ahead, not in all areas of technology, but in many areas of technology, they'll be ahead of us, especially because we're willfully forfeiting technological leadership right now by slashing science funding, by sort of banning solar batteries. It's funny, like Elon Musk was tweeting yesterday about how great solar is. Well, Elon Musk is absolutely right. He's right. Solar is great energy. And yet, because of stupid culture war, Fox News, boomer meme bullshit, we're going to block it in America. We're just holding ourselves back from the technologies of tomorrow. Of course, the progressives on the left, they want to, it's very like tech coded to say the left when you just mean progressives. You don't mean like Bernie Sanders specifically. You just mean all progressives. When I say progressives, you'll say the left. And so, but fine. It's the same thing. But those people, they're afraid of software. They hate software. They hate Mark Zuckerberg. He's like the guy they hate the most, even more than Elon probably. And then they just, they hate social media platforms for like taking all the money from journalistic ad revenue or whatever, right? They hate AI because it's going to take all our jobs and it's going to disrupt our comfy scheme, because modern progressivism is based on sort of redistribution. And in many ways, parasitism. It says this wealth is here. They don't know where it came from. It was private enterprise, but they don't want to say that. They're like, where'd this wealth come from? I don't know. I found a pot of gold. I will pass it out.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's what they want to do. And so, they see tech as working against that. And they're scared of software. But Republicans are scared of hardware. They're scared of solar power and batteries. They're scared that this is like, oh God, new thing. Oh my God, it's new. Help. Some of them are okay with nuclear power, but even then it's like, are they going to give you permits for nuclear power? Like Trump just slashed the office that gives like loans to nuclear power. And so now nuclear can't get built. Like South Carolina is going, help government. We need your help to build all these nuclear plants we want to build. And the government's like, no, bye. And so even nuclear, we're not going to build, but Republicans are scared of solar. They're scared of batteries. They're scared of, drones and electric cars and all this stuff, and autonomous cars. And they're scared of everyone's scared of autonomous cars because, like, it's software plus hardware. And then they're scared of vaccines. They're scared of biotech. They're oh god, mRNA vaccines, help! It's going to pollute my bodily autonomy. It's like, so they're scared of physical things, whereas Democrats are scared of software things. And between it, there's almost no technology in America that no one's scared of.
Sure.
The rounded corners of the iPhone are the only thing everyone agrees on in America. Rounded corners are good, but anything that actually does shit, Americans are scared. One tribe or the other of Americans are just scared of.
Yeah.
And you can't say, oh, but it's not, we're the tech. So a lot of the stuff that's being slashed is being slashed just because, like, the Republicans unleashed 28-year-old right-wing staffers who were brain poisoned by 4chan memes and think that everything in the government is woke bullshit that's trying to destroy Western civilization. They unleashed that on the engines of our prosperity. And so I don't know what to do with this, man. Like, I'm not sure there's anything I can do to protect Americans from suffering right now. And all I can do is say, look, this is bad. Don't do this. Go back to the thing that works. That's all I can do.
And maybe that's a good place to wrap for now, as we're at time. But this has been a great conversation about sort of the myths around the hollowing out of the middle class, as well as sort of thinking about China and the US and where we're going. No, as always, a great conversation. Until next time.
Until next time.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors.